안녕하세요 여러분, 넷달바입니다. 비트코인을 공부하면 좋은 점들이 한두 가지가 아니죠. 낮은 시간 선호를 비롯해서 미래에 대한 진지한 생각, 현재 삶에 대한 열정, 이런 여러 가지들이 있겠지만 저는 그 중에서도 돈이란 무엇인가라는 단순해 보이지만 매우 근원적인 이 질문, 비트코인 하드캐리 덕분에 강제로 마주하게 된다는 점을 꼽고 싶습니다.
돈? 많이 벌면 좋지.
나도 돈 많이 벌어서 나중에 이것저것 다 하면서 살고 싶어.
그러려면 어디에 투자해야 하는 거지?
이런 것들이야 누구나 흔히 해보는 질문들인데요. 정작 그 돈이라는 게 진정 뭘까? 이런 질문은 비트코인을 마주하기 전에는 깊이 던져볼 기회가 잘 없는 게 보통의 케이스일 겁니다. 누구나 여러 가지 경로를 통해서 비트코인을 알게 되고 또 깊이 빠져들어서 탐구하게 되는데요. 오늘은 그 중에서도 가장 디폴트, 기본 경로라고 할 수 있는 돈이란 무엇인가, 이 경로를 따라가는 사람에게 훌륭한 길잡이가 될 수 있는 린 알든의 What is Money Anyway 아티클입니다. 린 알든은 피터 맥코믹의 What Bitcoin Did 팟캐스트에 출연해서 이 아티클에 대해서 2년 전에 얘기를 나눴는데요. 이 아티클이 바로 린 알든의 최근 책 Broken Money의 뼈대가 된다고 할 수 있습니다. 이 둘은 돈의 본질, 돈의 역사, 수많은 화폐들의 변천, 그리고 지금 현대에 와서의 디지털 화폐, 스테이블 코인, CBDC, 그리고 비트코인의 가능성 등을 폭넓게 탐구하는데요. 좋은 돈이란 무엇인지, 왜 지금 우리가 이걸 고민해야만 하는지, 비록 2년도 넘은 팟캐스트지만 여전히 우리에게 중요한 화두를 던져주는 좋은 내용이라 생각해서 합본으로 가져와 봤습니다. 한번 영어 리스닝 공부한다 생각하시고 쭉 들어보시면 어떨까요? 참고로 이 아티클 전체를 오디오북으로 만든 영상, 그리고 생동감 넘치는 애니메이션으로 재구성한 30분짜리 더빙 영상 모두 업로드되어 있으니 같이 살펴보시면 좋을 것 같네요. 자, 그럼 시작하겠습니다.
So, okay, let's get into this. What is money? Why this subject? Why? I mean, it's been touched on. A lot of people have written about it before. Can I tell you what I think? It felt like you are looking at where we're headed, and to look at where we're headed, you need to see where we'd come from.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. And I think it's also one of those things where every several decades, or every better part of a century, there's a big transition in the last couple centuries about how we treat money and how money works. Basically, in part, money is a technology, right? So, and as technology changes, what we consider money changes. And then you add geopolitical, realities on top of that. And so I wanted to prepare people for what kind of I think we're going through this decade, because people often are used to picking investments, getting out of investments, getting into other investments, but they don't often think about the money itself. And funny enough, people in emerging markets think more about what is money, right? Because they often have to deal with a weak money, and so they want dollars instead, or they want other types of assets. Whereas people in developed countries hardly ever have to think about money. And it's also, there's so many things it touches on because it goes into the whole Bitcoin versus crypto thing. What is money versus what is some VC tech platform, right? It's like all these kind of questions go to what assets do you want to hold over the course of the next 10, 15 years as we go through some of these really big macro transitions. And it's kind of starting from first principles of what is money. And then, of course, the article draws from so much great expertise that is out there. Some people that are, long dead from the 1800s. Some of the references are older than that. And then other people, of course, that are active, in various communities, including people in gold, people in Bitcoin, people in fiat even. Kind of like just all these thought leaders, and saying what is their view of money, and how do I interpret that? How do I tie these together? How do I contrast these views of what is money?
So what I'm hoping from this is we get a show that I can send out to all my friends who I'm still struggling to get them to even consider the nature of money. And over the last, I would say 18 months to 2 years, I'd used Facebook as a testing ground. So Twitter that's out there in the noise with all the other crazies, but Facebook is friends and family, and I've tried to share ideas with those about why Bitcoin is important, why thinking about money is important, and nothing's landed. And to echo your point, even though we're at high inflation in the UK at the moment, I think we're at 6% in the UK. We know it's higher. We've seen a massive increase in commodity prices. My energy prices have up personally nearly 300% in a year. I filled up my car the other day when I went back, and it was something like £120 to fill up the car, probably double what it would cost here. But I still think people aren't fully understanding what's happening to their money. Whereas when I've been on trips with the show, when I went to Venezuela, it was a really important experience because people are using 5 different types of money, ranging from the bolivar, which they had to use, wanting dollars. Some people using Bitcoin, some people using the Colombian peso, and then that stupid crypto they created. We won't talk about that. But they really did understand money, and I think sometimes you're forced to understand it when it collapses. I think this insidious inflation we go through hasn't forced people to consider it enough. Some have, some haven't. So I think today is going to be super important. I'm hoping this is a show I can put in front of people, and people really think about that because there is a lot of risk to money right now.
Exactly, all around the world. So for the longest time, you only had to care if you were in developing countries where they have currency crises. But now developed markets are going through kind of a debt crisis and an inflation crisis. They haven't really gone through since the last time money had a big change, right? Since money changed from gold back to fiat. That's the last big money change that happened, and this environment kind of looks like that whole environment. And that whole thing was a process, right? So you kind of slowly started severing money from gold. It started in the World War I era and then the aftermath specifically. And then it carried on to the Great Depression. And then, of course, it carried on to World War II and the end of that, where you kind of had like a loose peg to gold, but not a direct connection. And then it was really in 1971, of course, it was completely severed. And that whole period we're kind of going through almost like a mirror image today, right? There's a bunch of charts that I show in all my articles of how debt, what debt looks like, what the deficits look like, what interest rates look like, and it's kind of a mirror image of that whole period. And so I think people have to be prepared for the changing nature of money, the digitization of money, so money becoming more digital in various ways, and how it's easy to fall into traps and think like this is money versus is not money. And it's actually, you have to go back to first principles and find out what is good money? What do I want to hold longer term?
Well, the starting point, when anyone does ask me what Bitcoin is, I always say it's money. That's it. It's just a form of money. And I used to try and come up with these kind of more complicated answers. But really, I've simplified it down to just explaining that it's a form of money, and then explaining the properties. But an interesting question, I'm going to jump around a bit here, so excuse me, but an interesting question for me to put to you is, we've had these periods where money has changed and money is a technology. If we had no Bitcoin, or we had no digitization, if there wasn't a technological change right now, but we were still going through a currency crisis, do you think we would see another change in the nature of money? Do you think the central powers would come together to do another Bretton Woods or another? Because it feels like we have this weird coincidence that at the time we're having this these currency crises around the world. We have had, fortunately, over a decade of something like Bitcoin to establish itself to be an alternative.
I think if you didn't have the creation of Bitcoin, one is that gold would be rising a little bit more in prominence than it is. And you can also kind of separate it between the sovereign level and the personal level, right? So we just saw, for example, the case I've been making for a while is that sovereign reserves are going to probably begin diversifying more than they have. So if you back up a long time, gold used to be the primary reserve. Then with the whole kind of Eurodollar, petrodollar system, they started putting the US Treasury at the heart of the whole global reserve system. And ever since really 2013, 2014, you've been seeing a little bit of a shift back towards sovereigns, being interested in holding gold as part of their assets, because they kind of could, compare that currency. They could treat it like money, look at it versus other fiat currencies, and it has certain advantages. It has a lower monetary inflation rate, and it has, you can self-custody it in a way that you can't do with liabilities of other entities, like other countries, right? So those can be frozen, but if you hold gold in your vaults, it's yours. And so there's been an uptick in interest in gold. It's also the only, alternative money or outside money, you can call it, that's big enough to absorb, kind of these large sovereign flows. But now with the invention of Bitcoin, it's interesting because it's more accessible to people around the world. Anyone with a smartphone really can for the most part access it. And it's too small for many large sovereigns at the point, but it's something that over time could become more interesting there. So I think that in the absence of it, we would see maybe kind of a return to gold. But the problem is that gold was somewhat flawed as money. Its shortcomings in terms of portability, audibility, things like that. So there's a reason why we disconnected from gold. And so I think that for lack of better alternatives, there'd be some kind of shift back. Either people would want to preserve their purchasing power, or even sovereigns would want to preserve their purchasing power and sovereignty. But now there's another option. So now there's kind of multiple things to look at. And then you have to compare not only fiat, you have to compare gold, you have to compare Bitcoin. You have to go around and be like, what properties am I looking for in a money?
Right. So what I want to do is, like I said, I want it to be a bit of a 101 for people. So I want to send this show around to people who I think maybe haven't thought about money enough. So I want to work through some of the basics with you. I want to help people understand the nature of what makes good money, what makes bad money. And then I want to dig into the uses of money, because I hadn't really considered it in terms of, consume, save, invest, and share, which is in your article, which we will share in the show notes. I know I do it. I know I use money for that, but I hadn't considered them individually and what makes good money for those different use cases. But I think it's a good starting point to talk about the key aspects of money. And Vijay Boyapati's article, The Bullish Case for Bitcoin, has that grid, which I think is fantastic.
I agree.
So when we talk, and I'll share that in the show notes as well, but when we talk about types of money, Bitcoin, fiat, and anyone listening doesn't know what fiat is, it's dollars, pounds, euros, etc. And gold, gold, fiat, and Bitcoin. We talk about these properties and how each form of money is suitable for those. So do you want to run through them and explain what makes good money and what makes bad money? Sure.
And as you point out, this has been highlighted by Vijay. Robert Breedlove's done a lot of work on this. Safety's done a lot of work on this. It's kind of like going through the properties of what makes good money and how they kind of compare to each other. And so you want like a list of criteria. So the whole purpose of money compared to an investment or something like that is that you want it to be liquid, safe, fungible. So if I buy a house or a specific company as an investment, that is something that is risky and that is something that is non-liquid and fungible. Like it's a specific thing. It's hard, it's a hassle for me to transfer it to someone else. That's kind of either a long-term bet or long-term savings or a specific plan to grow my investment with risk of loss. Whereas with money, it's kind of the opposite. I want like a low-risk battery of storing income now so that I can expend it in the future or share it or give it away or whatever I want to do. And so it's got to be liquid. It's got to be something that I can just easily transfer to someone. It's got to be something that is easily divisible, fungible, so that all the units are either identical or nearly identical. And it's got to be something that holds its value that I want to hold it longer term. And then I want to add other things, like you want it to be verifiable. You want it to be portable, and there's multiple ways to break that down. You can kind of look at different monies and like Vijay did, for example, you can score them on the different aspects, right? So for example, gold holds its value pretty well long term, right? Because gold's got a very, very low inflation rate, meaning the amount of gold that exists above ground grows at a very, very slow rate historically, and there's a good reason for that. Whereas other types of commodities can grow very quicker. And so gold ends up being a very good store of value, but it has shortcomings in terms of portability, divisibility, verifying that what you actually own is gold, like the ease of being able to do that. Whereas when you look at something like the dollar, they've made advances for how easily you can send it around, right? Because it's, you can have digital representations of it, and you can, it's very easy to move around. But of course, the downside is that, there's no constraint on how much they can print, other than kind of self-imposed restraint that is kind of meant to keep guardrails on the system and it, stop it from hyperinflating. So there's kind of guardrails on it, but they're self-imposed. And so over time, in practical terms, the rate of new dollar creation is much faster than the rate of new gold creation, right? So when you compare those, you think, okay, those are interesting. We obviously have to pay them for tax purposes. We have to, have some working capital to use them. They're liquid. The government specifically does their best to try to control the volatility at the exchange of devaluation, but they try to control the volatility of it. And so there's advantages, but they're not a great long-term place to store capital. And so when you go down the list, each type of money has shortcomings. And when you look at something like Bitcoin, it's interesting because the innovation there is that it kind of took the best properties of gold and fiat and mixed them together. So you have the slow monetary inflation rate of gold. In the long run, it's even less because eventually, the inflation rate trends towards zero, right, with Bitcoin. And you have that scarcity. But then you also have the better divisibility, better portability, and better verification. And so in many ways, it's across the board better than most other monies, with a couple of weaknesses relative to, it's still relatively untested. It's got 13 years of testing, 13 years of monetization. It's smaller than dollars or gold, so it's less liquid, far more volatile, less widely held, less widely accepted. And so what we can describe it as is an emerging money. And all anyone has to do is kind of look at the properties of it and determine if that's something that they want to hold relative to other monies, if that's something that's valuable to them. So a lot of people will still kind of put it in the speculation camp or the investment camp. And I think it's a reasonable way to interpret it, because you're betting that the way it's behaved for 13 years and the properties it's had for 13 years are going to continue. So you've analyzed the probability of this occurring. You're making some sort of future judgment about this relatively new system. So that makes sense. But on the other hand, you can literally use it as insurance, because it's one of the few types of monies that you can easily self-custody. It's more portable than other types of monies. And we've seen this throughout emerging markets, right? It's easy to have, it's hard to move across borders with gold or physical cash. It's hard to transfer bank money around the world. But Bitcoin's something that you can literally self-custody and pretty much move wherever you want. And so I don't think the world fully realizes its properties yet and what that means.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about VJ's chart is the way he grades each form of money, that can change over time.
Yes.
But one thing I wonder if is missing, and perhaps is missing to the benefit of Bitcoin, is volatility. And I think price volatility is something which is helpful to understand in consideration for this, because if you look at the chart, or you look at VJ's chart, to me it implies, oh, well, that's the best form of money. It can do every single thing I want. Therefore, I should hold all my money in Bitcoin. But there's a risk to that because of volatility. And I always felt like if you wanted to make a decision about which forms, maybe multiple forms of money, there's argument to hold a basket of Bitcoin, gold, and maybe dollars. And I know that's heresy with some Bitcoiners, but I think that you can make a solid argument if you wanted to plan long term. You could have a mix, but to consider that mix, I think volatility should be considered. Do you think that's fair or not?
I think it's a huge variable, especially for medium exchange and unit of account, right? So basically, I would describe Bitcoin as an emerging money. It's a 13-year-old money, right? So it doesn't have the track record or the size of those other monies. And because it's a smaller market, it has more volatility. It's got basically a bigger range of outcomes for how it could look in 10 years compared to, say, gold, right? So because there's a bigger gap of expectations about what this could become, the volatility is very large. In addition, because it's a smaller market, less liquidity, even though it's got quite a bit of liquidity, it's got less liquidity than say, the dollar market or the gold market. And that's because it's smaller. And so, if a Michael Saylor comes in, they can potentially move the market. Whereas if you have a handful of hedge funds, fast money deciding to sell it because of whatever macro factor they're looking at, that can also move the market. And also because it's known for good returns, there's even though leverage in the space is actually small relative to market cap or other ways of looking at it, there's individual parts of the market that are extremely leveraged, and those easily get liquidated when you have big moves to the upside or downside, which exacerbates volatility. And so it's kind of, people are betting on it in a way they don't bet on, say, gold and things like that, or at least not at this scale. And so that adds to volatility. And one way to think about fiat currencies is they try to optimize for low volatility, but then the sacrifice they make is devaluation, right? So they kind of have this manual adjustment mechanism where if you get deflation, they want to print a lot more. If they start getting inflation, they try their best to throttle that back. And they've had mixed success with that. But basically, you never really have a case where developed market currency is 50% less useful the next year, right? Whereas that can happen with Bitcoin, even more so. Now, in extreme historical events, even those fiat currencies, they break down. So they go decades and decades and decades without having a major volatility event. And then you get like a 1933 event where it's just, it's practically cut in half. Or you have like emerging markets go through this far more often. The Egyptian pound had a month where it just cut in half about 5 years ago. And so that kind of thing is common throughout the world, unfortunately. But in developed markets, from year to year, the volatility is low. And that, combined with the fact that it's recognized as legal tender, makes it a useful form of kind of like near-term money that you can save it. It's going to be worth roughly the same in 6 weeks, and you kind of go about your day. And that matters for people where their incomes and their expenses are very close, right? So if you're living in a country and you're making $400 a month and your expenses are $400 a month, you can't like risk holding a lot of your assets or whatever assets you might have in something that can go up 50% or go down 50% during that time. You pretty much have to have a stable amount because you have no margin for error. Whereas, of course, if you have a large pool of capital, you have a better ability to withstand volatility. So it's kind of a privilege to be able to accept volatility for harder, better money in the long term.
Well, Alex Gladstein talks a lot about this in certain markets, that tether is much more important than Bitcoin. Turkey, what the inflation rate? Did I see it's over 100% now? I can't.
It was very, very high.
Yeah.
I think it was high double digits. It was insane.
And he talks about, say, people who in Palestine who struggle financially. And he said for a lot of people in these places, they cannot risk having a high volatile asset such as Bitcoin because they have day-to-day costs. And maybe they could have a small amount in there and hopefully that'll appreciate in value. But some people live in hand to mouth. So something like tether has become super important in these markets. And when he explains to me the importance of that, I've had to check myself on criticisms of altcoins. And I think there are fair criticisms of them. But at the same time, if these are currently solving a problem for people, I find it hard to take a firm position against them.
Yeah, I've not been bearish on stable coins overall. I think that it's obviously an innovation. Like if anyone who tries sending money internationally, stable coins are an improvement.
Yeah.
It's just better technology. Obviously, I'd like to see them on Bitcoin, right? And so we've actually seen some announcements at the conference about being able to bring stable coins back to Bitcoin Lightning. So all else being equal, I'd like to see them there. But yeah, one of the few cases in altcoin land that actually has use case, I think, has been the stablecoin market. And Tether's an example, whether it runs on Ethereum or others. It can run on any, if a chain gets too expensive, it starts spilling onto another chain. And that is useful for people. And even like an example was Lebanon, where they're going through a major currency event. Even ones that were holding dollars in bank, that then is prone to confiscation, transferring back to the local currency. And so ironically, Tether ends up being safer for them than holding their dollars in a local bank. Whatever questions people might have about Tether's collateral or things like that, their ability to blacklist addresses, they look at that compared to what's happening in their local banking system. They're like, well, I'll take the Tethers. And so it is important for people, especially when there's not a big margin between your expenses and your income, to have a low volatility asset. And so that can mean different things to different people. I mean, currency is generally very low volatility over, say, a 2-month period, except for extreme events. Then you have gold that's more volatile than that. And then Bitcoin's obviously far more volatile than that. And that's actually one of the downsides longer term, is that there's then an inverse correlation between volatility and their ability to hold value long term. And so the cost of that volatility management is ongoing devaluation.
Okay, so there's going to be a range of listeners on the show. I'm not worried about the people who are understanding how to balance their fiat versus Bitcoin. I think they get it, and they're going to get a lot out of this show just because you bring so much to the table, Lim. But there are going to be some people, I really hope there's some people here who only hold dollars or only hold pounds and are starting to think about this. And it's interesting when you start to consider the different uses of money, taken straight from the article, the use to consume, save, invest, and share. Personally, running through this, majority of my consumption is with my traditional pound bank account. I use my card and I pay for things, or I withdraw cash and I pay for things. But when we come to saving, whilst I have a small amount in pound, I don't tend to save too much in pounds. It's the money I tend to put away for the next year. But anything long term is going into Bitcoin, because I know long term that's where I feel that's a better place to save money. Investing is kind of interesting because certain things I'm investing in. Football club, for example, that's an investment of pounds. I've just taken from savings and put that into that. But I can see scenarios where I'd invest Bitcoin into Bitcoin companies. And then when we talk about sharing, actually the majority of my sharing is actually Bitcoin. Because that's appreciated so well, and there's so many projects that accept Bitcoin and they accept internationally. I've actually been doing that. But I think it's interesting to start to consider, I actually need different monies for different purposes. Can you run through this and why you did this breakdown? Because it's actually the first time I've seen somebody do this, and it's made me think about money in a different way.
Yeah, I think during monetary transitions, that becomes very common to use multiple types of money.
Yep.
Like you were saying in Venezuela, for example, there's like 5 common types of money, and that's because they're going through a very difficult time. It's kind of like the more stability there is, the less need there is for multiple types of money. And when you have all these imperfections with different types of money, or at least imperfections as part of their journey. So for example, Bitcoin's imperfection, we can call it, is the volatility. But you're early on and that volatility is inevitable, right? So whatever the type of money might be, there's going to be like a downside to it. And so they kind of use that for the things that it solves and use another type of money for the things that solves. And so when we go back to what we can do with our assets, right? So if we have a surplus of what we generate versus what we do, we can either, one, we can just consume it. We can just, use it up in various ways, discretionary. 2, we can save it. And the whole point of savings is something that you expect to not be super volatile, but that of course is different time frames. So you might want to save for something 6 months from now, and you need to have pretty low volatility for that. If you're saving up for a down payment on a house, for example, compared to something, if you're saving multi-year, you're willing to accept more volatility, but you still want it to be pretty much a sure thing. You want it to not lose value significantly over the longer term.
So hold on 1 second. My Bitcoin is both this saving and investment.
That's currently where it is in this transition, right? Because it's a more volatile money, and because it's earlier on in its monetization process, it kind of blends the category between savings and investment. And I think it's also partially, the more knowledgeable someone gets on it, they might start putting it more in the savings camp. Whereas people that are approaching it for the first time really think about it in the investment camp. But really it has aspects of both, right? Because it's this 13-year-old asset that's monetizing. And when you hold Bitcoin, you're making an assessment of its properties relative to others, kind of like how you would investment. If I buy one stock over another stock, I'm making an assessment of its properties and saying I want to own stock A and not stock B. Same thing with Bitcoin. I'm looking at the properties and saying, okay, it's not something I want to hold if I have a 6-week, if I'm going to buy for something in 6 weeks, right? I'm not going to store it in Bitcoin, but it's something I want to hold if I want to, make a expectation about what's going to happen 5 years from now.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about the sharing bit, because I definitely didn't think about that as a separate area. If you just said, "What do I do with money?" I'd be saying, "Well, yeah, I buy stuff with it, and yes, I save with it, and I certainly invest with money." But I never would have thought about sharing as an important separate category.
Yeah, it's its own thing I like to characterize that as essentially investing in your community, right? So it's another, you can kind of put it in the investment category, but it's a very different type because you're not trying to invest specifically for yourself. I think a lot of us are, we're wired to want to help the community around us. That's kind of how we survived as a species. We're not like these like isolated, our social interactions are a key part of what makes us human. And so sharing is a key part of kind of investing in our community and just helping other people. And so when you have some sort of surplus, you can consume, you can save, you can invest, you can share. And there can be different types of monies or different types of assets, even if you're talking about investment in non-monies, like things like stocks or companies or real estate, that serve those purposes differently. And ideally, in the long run, you'd have one money that can do it all, right? Maybe, Bitcoin after 25 years can check off more boxes than it can check off now. Right now, it can check off a bunch, and the longer it goes on, it might be able to increase the number of boxes that it can check off in terms of someone's finances.
Yeah, it's funny you consider it there as an investment in your community. I was talking to Danny about it beforehand. I actually thought of sharing as more like consumption, in that I am choosing, because I have a choice to spend it on myself or to give it to somebody else. And when you give it to somebody else, you have that kind of feeling, that good feeling, like you're helping other people. So I actually also considered it as consumption as well.
I agree. No, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a really good way to understand the the different uses of money, and therefore, like you say, during a transitionary period, while you need to consider the monies you have and what you use them for, we are though in this transitionary period. Very obvious to us what's happening. Even more obvious to you as somebody who can read the market like tea leaves and spot everything that's happening. I think this is one of the really important things for people who haven't fully understood what's happening for the nature of money right now, or haven't fully considered, let's say, all digital money, not just Bitcoin, the advent of CBDCs. I don't think we should spend too long on the history, because I'd encourage people to go and read it and read the other articles that have done. But can you give like a brief summary of how we've got to where we are, the different transitions, and then we'll cover specifically what's happening with money right now?
Sure. So through that lens, money is technology.
Yeah.
And as technology changes, our money changes. And so we can put it in three buckets: commodity money, fiat money, and digital money, right? That is kind of one way to kind of just simplify it. And so commodity money was the reality for thousands of years, where you're trying to figure out, if someone has apples and they farm apples, they want to turn that into products and services. Rather than try to line up all these people that need apples, she can find a third asset, something that everybody wants, and sell her apples for that, and then being able to use that as her savings and her expenditure in the future, right? And so you need something that is, going back to the properties we discussed, that is liquid, fungible, everybody wants it, it stores its value pretty well, it's easy to move around, you can transfer a decent amount of value with a small amount of space and weight, and so various commodities kind of serve that role. And the risk there is that if technology improves, you can make a lot more of those commodities. And so you can threaten the value long-term of those commodities. And so kind of like if you look at history, you kind of go up the scale to all these different, you can use salt as money, you can use coconuts as money, you can use livestock as money, you can use copper as money. And as technology improved, and as cultures with different levels of technology kind of interface with each other, the harder monies would win out over these ones that technology can devalue. And eventually you wound up with gold and silver, and then really it was gold that kind of came out on top in the end. And so that's kind of the history of commodity monies. And it's because gold has like an inherent kind of a difficulty adjustment built in. So as time progressed, we got a lot of the easy gold deposits, and as our technology improved, we could access harder gold deposits, but it's increasingly hard to get that gold. And so actually, almost no matter how much human technology improves, we've had trouble making more than 2% more gold per year, right? And that's kind of the upper limit, except for very brief moments where we find a new continent or some sort of massive step change. Other than rare moments like that, we don't really know how to make more gold quickly. And so that's why it's kind of stood the test of time compared to virtually every other commodity in terms of being good long-term savings. But because the downside is portability and auditability, it eventually got very centralized. So it would get collected in banks and claimed would be made on the gold. And then it got increasingly collected into central banks, where not even banks held the gold anymore. And so you had a complete detachment from what people used as medium of exchange, partially for convenience and partially due to legal decree. Governments had an interest in kind of collecting the gold, while people, would be expected to use the papers. And then but the risk there is that you can just, with a stroke of a pen on midnight one day, just sever the connection between those papers and the gold. And that's what happened in countries around the world multiple times until it happened permanently in 1971. And so we've been in this era of fiat currency where it's almost like an artificial commodity. So for example, the rate of, the stock to flow ratio, so how much money exists versus how much is created in a year, is higher than most commodities. So that's important as a money. It's lower than gold and silver, but it's higher than, say, oil or copper, things like that. And so you have kind of a workable money. Its volatility is managed by the government and the central bank. There's various checks and balances for who can create money, and kind of the number of people that have to sign off on new money creation, at least in kind of these developed markets. But the downside is longer term. Your monetary inflation rate is 7%, 8%, 10%, 15%, and of course in many countries far higher. And the interest rates rarely keep up with that long term. So you basically get diluted as you hold stake in that network. We can call it a network. You keep your percentage of that network keeps getting diluted over time by holding it. In addition, it still has shortcomings in terms of auditability, right? So, for example, in there's a lot of dollars held offshore, and then those get levered, and then but those still represent claims essentially for U.S. assets. And there's actually, it's a very opaque market because it does not have great auditability. And it also, obviously paper money can be counterfeited. And so it has various imperfections. And so that's been something that's been kind of plaguing humanity for a while, I would say, is that money is this kind of political thing and devalues. And then especially for people living in emerging markets, it becomes, you have like a hyperinflation event once a generation at least, right? And so that happens in developed markets around the world, developing countries around the world, I mean. And so it's bad enough in developed markets, and it's 10 times worse as you go down the spectrum if you go towards they call it the periphery of the financial system, people that, countries that they're not near the core of the whole money creation process. They're not the Fed, they're not the ECB, they're not the Bank of Japan. They're in these periphery markets, and they have all the volatility of the system. So the developed world kind of pushes the volatility out to them, and they get all the downside of the system and none of the upsides. And now, first you had the creation of Bitcoin, and then you had various entities study that and say, okay, can we do this to fiat? Can we put fiat on the blockchain? Then you get stable coins. Then you get governments look at that and say, hey, can we just make stable coins like issued by the government? Can we make digital money? Can we improve our banking rails? And people often say that the dollar's already digital. The fiat money is already digital. Your money is just a ledger in a bank mainframe, and that's partially true. But the digital change adds a lot of new variables for how much they can track it, how much they can control it, how much they can freeze it, how much automated it can be, right? So if you're sending money from entity to entity, it can be much more automated if it's digitally native compared to those old bank rails. And so I think one way or another, we're going to this future where, due to the application of technology, money is increasingly digital, which makes it more verifiable, easier to transfer, things like that. But of course, the huge risk there is that it increases surveillance and control capabilities, which, going back to, living in different countries, that can mean very different things depending on what country you're in. A CBDC in Norway could be very different from a CBDC in China, for example, what the actual practical implications mean. But either way, it kind of puts people at the whim of the entities that control that money. And Bitcoin is basically, I would say, the creation of commodity money in digital form. So they made something that requires work to produce, which is unlike the fiat currency system and unlike most of these other digital assets. And it actually goes back to the days of commodity money, except it improves on that because it makes it more divisible, more verifiable, and more portable. And so we're kind of in this world now where you have, digital bearer assets like Bitcoin being the most, the most immutable, the most money-like out of all of them, commodity money, hard money. And then you have various imitators. And then you have stable coins, which are basically fiat currency in digital form. And then you have, nationalized stable coins, which are centralized CBDCs, where the central bank issues the money and has complete control over how it's used.
Digitized commodity money. That's very cool. Never had it explained like that.
Even
years.
Satoshi explained like that once.
Really?
He talked about how he's like, imagine a metal that is boring gray in color, can't be used for a lot of things, but it's as rare as gold, but that has one unique property that you can send it over a communications channel. And that's kind of that was one way he kind of helped people think about what Bitcoin is. And he's like, if for any reason this kind of weird commodity became valuable if it had any sort of value, it could be a useful type of money because you could send it to people and they could either spend it or they could convert it to something else and then spend it there. And so that's one of the ways he conceptualized it. So even he thought of it as kind of a digital commodity money.
Out of control of government. I put the Hayek quote in here. I've actually seen him. I've seen the YouTube clip. I'm going to read it for people. I don't believe we shall ever have a good money again before we take the thing out of the hands of government. That is, we can't take them violently out of the hands of government. All we can do is by some sly roundabout way introduce something they can't stop. I mean, that's an incredible quote to read now.
Yeah, because it's Bitcoin before Bitcoin existed. He was the first Bitcoiner.
Yeah.
And to kind of translate that. So for example, commodities money is dictated by nature, right? So nature and our technology against nature determines how much of it we can create and what its properties are. Fiat currency is something that is in the hands of the government. They can determine essentially how much there is, who, what are the rules about how to use it. And the invention of Bitcoin represents a way to take all the properties of commodity money, or at least most of the properties, and then put them in digital form. And so you have something that's proof of work. So you have to expend real world resources to create it. And then, among all the different blockchains out there, Bitcoin's the one that it actually is decentralized and relatively immutable. It's the one that's the closest to representing an actual commodity rather than an equity security, a network that requires kind of ongoing governance and kind of a centralized hub is the closest thing we have in digital form to a commodity money.
For you, Lynn, do you still have moments with Bitcoin where you have a kind of like you have a step change, deeper understanding of it and become even more convinced by it? Because just like then I hadn't heard Satoshi explain it like that, but to hear you explain what commodity money is and then explain Bitcoin as digital commodity money, that is another step change for me, another kind of light bulb moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we all kind of approach it from lenses we understand. So that was one of my early ways of approaching it,
right?
Is seeing it as digital commodity money. That's kind of how I got it first. And all my hesitations were like, what are ways that this could be, damaged, or how could its immutability be compromised? How could its shortcomings be exploited? Things like that. So it's more like from the very beginning, I acknowledged it as commodity money, and then it was like, is it good enough commodity money? Just how in the past, different commodity monies would compete, and some of them would be found wanting and would get kind of pushed aside as money. So the whole question was, how hard is Bitcoin? How is it going to hold up in the long term as commodity money? And so the longer it goes, the more of its properties you understand, it's doing quite well. And so I think for me, the biggest implications are just seeing how it can change finance. The larger it gets and the more development that happens on it. So for now, I'm looking at things like other layers, what's happening in Lightning, what's happening on Liquid, things like that, and how that can transform some of the ways that all of finance operates. And I think the idea of having, the whole point is you have an immutable base layer and then a programmable other aspects of it. So you can do programming on top. It's basically programmable commodity money. And I think the implications of that are crazy, especially when you look out 10, 20 years, because software is one of the few things that just keeps expanding exponentially. And it's like, what is it going to look like in 20 years when you have programmable money and people have been programming on it for decades?
Maybe that's your book.
I think I'd have to hire programmers to help me. I've written some code, but I'm in no means a programmer, so I'd have to.
I think more when you talk about how it can change finance, what are the things you're kind of looking out for on these layers? Like at a rudimentary level, I'm really interested in these new Bitcoin-backed mortgages. I think they're fascinating. For me, like I've just bought a house, so the timing isn't right. But if it was in now and I could get one of these Bitcoin mortgages, they actually, to me, make a lot of sense. But what are the kind of things that you're looking at? Are there big changes in finance you think Bitcoin can bring in?
Well, I think longer term, yes. I think basically over the past couple of decades, we've monetized non-money assets because our money's been so bad, right? Because our money constantly devalues. We're like, this is a hot potato. We want to get rid of it. And so we put a monetary premium on other things. And that actually makes those things less accessible for people that just want to use those for the utility value. So for example, if I don't know what to do with my money, so I buy a second home and I treat that as an investment, if enough people have that practice, it bids up the price of homes and therefore makes buying a first home less accessible to someone who really just wants the utility value of a home. And the same thing for stocks. We've bid up the valuations of stocks because we're saying, okay, I'd rather store my money in a diverse collection of stocks than in bond dollars or treasuries. And one of the things that if you have the reintroduction of credible hard money, it can demonetize some of those assets, take away that extra monetary premium. So they're still valuable. Real estate's still valuable. Equities are still valuable, but you might have less of a valuation premium on them. And that could make them more accessible to people, make their returns better. And you put that monetary premium in the hard money. So I think that's one. But then two, yeah, you have all sorts of like just improvements. You apply automation to finance. So, you have less friction and gummed up issues in the whole banking system, right? And so it's a very manual process. and you can take out a large portion of that manual process and automate it. And so if money moves faster, the question is, how can that influence economic growth rates? So as kind of the world population has aged and kind of slowed down, GDP growth has been on the downtrend. And the question is, if you unlock faster money, what does that mean? And freer money, and more people able to access that money. So for example, if people around the world that are kind of in these, say periphery markets that have trouble accessing good money, what if we expand dramatically the number of people in the world that are able to access good money? What can they do with it? Right? And so that's exciting to me, because you open up the market for so many more people and talented people throughout the world that can now access this open monetary network.
So if we've gone through these transitionary periods now, we've had commodity money, we had the gold standard, Bretton Woods, the petrodollar system. We're heading into this kind of digitization of money, which we've talked about and you talk about in the article. For you, is this now an inevitable change?
Well, I think the digitization of money is inevitable. And then the question is, which type becomes dominant, right? Is Bitcoin strong enough to kind of push back on government control over it? Or does it run into a number of shortcomings, and governments are able to make their CBDCs rather dominant? And I err towards Bitcoin being successful long term. I think it has the properties of it's hard enough. It checks off a number of boxes, and even the boxes it doesn't check off are within sight of being able to be checked off as technology improves and as it gets just more widely held and it becomes better. And so I think longer term, Bitcoin is you can call it the fastest horse in the race. It's I think the best thing to bet on, even though, for most people, I wouldn't recommend 100% allocation to Bitcoin, but I think it's something that's silly not to have any of at this point. I think in 2022, if you have zero Bitcoin, I think the person has to probably spend more time looking into what that is.
Are you listening, Peter Schiff? Okay, so if we head into a world of Bitcoin winning, what do we lose by not having fiat money, government money, whether that's as we have it now or CBDC? We know governments have levers to help with the economy. Some Bitcoiners will be like, we don't care. I don't care. But you, as somebody who's a macroeconomics analyst, is there anything you think we lose that we might miss?
It's hard. So these types of changes, I think it's easy to overestimate what they can do in a couple years, but then underestimate what they can do in the longer term. And so that's the part that's really hard to fully grasp. It could, for example, change the optimal size of a nation state. So if money's more portable inherently, that kind of opens up the competition between different countries, right? So, before, if it's harder to transfer your assets, there's more frictions. That means the jurisdiction has a little bit more control. If someone can take the vast majority of their assets with them easily, then it's like it kind of opens up jurisdictions as like you can shop for jurisdictions. And one implication of that is that's something that's really accessible to the rich more so than the middle class or the poor. And so it kind of that's something that really does advantage you if you're kind of privileged in some ways. And so I think that's going to be interesting implications longer term. That might be something that if you can get brain drain out of certain areas that are struggling, where the people that have the resources, that have the skills can get out, and it makes it hard for that area to recover, right? But it's hard to predict long term what that means. And I think it's one of those things that it changes. I think this is like a phase transition. So it's not something that just happens overnight. So I think it could change governance and things in some ways, but I think they're hard to foresee.
And it could be, we could go through a period of time where we have a government digital money alongside Bitcoin, and maybe some countries will launch a CBDC. I'm still not sure it'll happen here in the US. I'm not 100% sure in the UK. I know it exists in China. I know other countries are trying. Who knows? But for while we wait for Bitcoin to win, or while the race is happening, these other currencies will exist. So somebody listened to this, Lynn, they're still going to have to consider the relationship between what they hold in terms of, say, fiat and what they hold in terms of Bitcoin. Now, you've talked about developed markets seeing currency collapses. We've raised Venezuela today. We've talked about Lebanon. We've talked about Turkey. There's Argentina. There's plenty of other countries that are seeing high inflation and seeing currency collapses. But for the first time in my life, I feel like my domestic currency, the pound, is at risk of very high inflation. There's lots of weird things happening. The same here in the US. So just for somebody listening who might not understand, what is the kind of like worst and best case scenario that you're planning for with regards to what's happening with the dollar?
I use the 40s as a lot of a kind of description of what's happening now. And that was pre-war, right? So now it actually got closer, unfortunately, to that comparison, because now we're adding, additional kinetic war to the mix. But essentially, the last time that the developed world was as indebted as it is now on the sovereign level was the 1940s. And that was a result of all the imbalances during that period and then the large wars. And the way that was largely handled was massive currency devaluation, right? So interest rates would be held low because if you have 100% or 150% debt to GDP, you can't pay 10% interest rates on that. That's how you spiral into bankruptcy. So they just hold rates low, even if inflation's double digits. And that doesn't mean interest rates can't go up, but if you go up from 1% to 0% to 3%, while inflation's 8% or 12% or whatever the number is, that you're still getting devalued. Your share of that network is being diluted over time. My concern is that as we enter an environment of scarcer commodities, as we enter an environment of even just partial deglobalization, so just the lack of continuing of globalization, maybe hold on to the globalization we have, maybe claw it back to some degree, all of those adds friction and inflationary forces to the system. And so I think we have a lot more kind of inherently inflationary forces in the real stuff that we need to consume at the same time as the money system, the amount of the monetary inflation, so the number of new units being created, the percent increase per year is above average. Interest rates are super low, and because of the debt, they have trouble raising them. That's a recipe for ongoing currency devaluation, and then throughout the world, that can result in kind of massive political revolutions, protests.
Well, we're seeing this right now. I mean, was
exactly.
it Peru I just saw last week? Protests. We've seen protests in Turkey. But we're seeing, it feels like this is a growing issue.
Yeah. And I think that generally whenever you have food prices spike and you have fuel prices spike, and especially when it happens faster than wages can adjust, because those things can happen over the course of a month, whereas it's not like everyone's wages just automatically tick up to match that during that month. That's when you get these massive protests because people can't put food on their table. They can't, power their car, their motorcycle, whatever the case may be. They just can't do the things they have to do in order to function in life. And that's when they hit their last straw and they go out and protest, and it can get pretty violent. And so that's the challenge of these decades of commodity scarcity and these decades of big monetary transitions. And there's no silver bullet. There's not something that someone can do to entirely eliminate risk. And there's going to be people that are really negatively impacted by this. But the way that people can protect themselves is by doing a careful assessment of where they're storing their assets. So are they storing their assets in things that can be devalued beyond, obviously you need some working capital, or at least most people, unless you're super tech savvy, you kind of optimize it to see, be on your own kind of like Bitcoin standard or something. But if, for vast majority of people, you need working capital, you need some kind of low volatility money for incoming spending, things like that. But your actual kind of reserve, to the extent that you can have them, you want to be very selective with what you own. And you want to look at things like scarcity. Can it grow long term? What's its value? What's the value of this thing going to be like 5-10 years from now, most likely relative to other things? And then also, depending on where they are in the world, is it something they can self-custody or not? And that's actually, that's one of the rare aspects of money, is that unlike, I can't self-custody an equity. I'm on someone else's ledger if I own an equity. Same thing with a bond. Real estate's obviously it's not portable. And so there's actually very few things that you can hold it and it's a bearer asset that just you hold it outside of the system. There's no counterparty risk. And, gold has traditionally filled that role where someone can have a small amount of gold and it's just theirs. It's an asset that is not someone else's liability. So equities are technically liabilities of the company. Bonds are obviously liabilities. Currencies are liabilities of the central bank. All of these assets are some other entity's liability, except for these like fundamental bearer assets, things like gold. And then now, over the past 13 years, we have Bitcoin, and it's more portable. You can transfer it with you pretty much wherever you go. You can use it for censorship resistant payments if you need to. It has a variety of use cases. And so I think in addition to being an investment, in addition to being savings, it's also insurance. It gives you kind of that optionality in a way that other assets don't.
Amazing. Okay, just want to tell you the last thing that I really liked from your article, because I've never seen this before either. I'm wondering, is this one of yours? Proof of force.
Yeah, that was so. I've seen people describe it as proof of violence.
Proof of violence.
Yeah, because if you, for example, I quoted Moser in there. He's he kind of created MMT, or kind of revitalized an older form of analysis called chartalism. The idea that money is kind of, issued by the government, and if you look at his quotes about how the money system works, it is essentially proof of violence, proof of the ability to exert force over someone. And that sounds extreme. But of course, different jurisdictions, that means different things. So even in a relatively benign country, there's, you have to pay your taxes usually in that country's currency. And if you don't, you either get a knock on the door by people with guns, or you have to leave, right? And so it's like, if you want to be involved in that system, you have certain obligations to that system. And so that's how, because one of the ways I want to describe it was, so we had this whole multi-thousand-year history of commodity money, and they harder and harder monies kept winning out over softer and softer monies until you ended up with gold. And then the question was, how did gold lose to paper, right? How did it lose to paper? Because it was the only kind of downgrade in human history where you went to softer money globally. And it's like, how did that happen? And it's like, well, it's because it was enforced. It's something that it either gets really blatant, like in the United States, where they literally said Americans cannot own gold under threat of 10 years of imprisonment, which is kind of insane if you think about it today. Or just more subtle things like, okay, you want to hold gold, we're going to tax every time you use it, right? So it's no longer money, it's no longer legal tender. We're going to tax it every time you want to transfer it. We're going to treat it like a stock or something like that. Even in some cases worse than a stock, higher capital gains, long-term capital gains taxes than a stock. And so it kind of makes it just inherently more friction to use. And through those various measures, you can enforce the use of a fiat currency. You can say this is the only thing you can pay your taxes with, and moving around every other type of asset is a taxable event. And so that's how those systems have been able to survive for decades.
Well, I love proof of force. I think we need to meme that into existence as a common term for attributed to CBDCs, which versus proof of work, I think, is an easier way for people to understand why it's a better form of money. Lynn, again, it's brilliant. Everything you do is brilliant. I love this. I do want you to write a book, because I think it would be amazing.
Eventually, I'd like to. I appreciate that.
You'll get there. Anything else you want to talk about before we leave? You want to tell anyone about anything?
I think that covers it. I think the important thing is to have an open mind, right? Because all monetary transitions in history rewarded people with an open mind. And that doesn't mean your mind's so open that your brain falls out. You know that old term, like, don't be so open-minded that you're not critical, right? You want to be critical, but you also want to be open. And so that involves taking small steps, being like, think through from first principles. What does this mean? So there are times where we don't have to go back to first principles and reassess everything. We can just kind of assume that things that worked out are going to keep working out. But there are big transition periods where that's not going to be the case, and you have to go back to the root of what assets you want to own, what is money, what is a good investment, where do you want to live in the world, things like that. Just kind of reassess from first principles what it is you're doing here and what you're optimizing for and what the risks are to you personally as well as broadly. And so the interesting thing about the Bitcoin space is that there are people that make a call about Bitcoin. Like someone's like, I don't like Bitcoin because X, Y, Z. And then they get told to have fun staying poor. And so they harden. They like, then there's no amount of information that will ever change them. Like they've made their decision. And I think the trick for surviving this decade is to not be like that. Don't be someone who makes a viewpoint and then that's your viewpoint now. You can never change your viewpoint because your ego is now tied to your viewpoint. I think this is going to be a decade that kind of rewards, someone whose ego is under control. You're kind of always curious. You're always assessing what's going on. What are the risks facing me? What are the risks to my assets? What did I maybe miss a year ago? What did I miss 2 years ago? And I think that's the way to move forward, is to just be open-minded, because all of these monetary transitions involve people that could think of the unthinkable and that could look past how the system currently is and envision if you were to start with a blank sheet of paper, how could it be? What are the alternative kind of timelines we could be under? And I think that's important to think of going forward.
I agree. I also think it's a decade that's going to reward people who are signed up to the Lint Order newsletter, which I pimp every time we make a show because I think it's amazing. Lynn, this is incredible. Love talking to you. Thank you so much. Great to see you again in person. And I just can't wait to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
At the end of the day, do you think we should have a central bank that is trying to set the price of money, or should we move to a more market-centric solution?
So I think in the long arc of time, yes, I think that not having a central price setter for money is ideal, and that the price of money can be set in different regions by market forces. That's the system that used to be, and I think that in the future might have that again one day. I think a big challenge is that, starting in the second half of the 1800s, commerce started moving faster than money. Right. So for thousands of years, commerce and money moved at roughly the same rate, which was, the speed of traveling around. But with the introduction of telecommunications channels, banks could settle ledgers across the world pretty quickly. And then, of course, when you add the internet, it accelerates even more. Whereas the money, gold, still had, it still moves at the speed of physics, of matter. And so when commerce began moving much faster than the underlying bare asset, we had to abstract it in order to have it keep up. Right, so we had to do claims based on that money rather than the money itself in order to keep up with the speed of commerce. And the problem there is that when you abstract it like that, when the speed of commerce greatly exceeds the speed of money, that allows for arbitrage and centralization. And so I think that that's been really the story of the past, call it 150 years of monetary history, is that policymakers have been able to arbitrage that difference and make use of the fact that we have a separation between the claims to the money and the underlying money itself. And so I think in some ways it was inevitable to happen. I mean, when we see something happen where there's 200 countries, which country doesn't have a central bank? Which country has free banking currently? Which country is on a gold standard? It's kind of like once it became possible to do, it happens everywhere. And so I think that, after this particular system works itself out, we'll see what happens with the next system. Maybe we can go back to a different type of model that is more decentralized. But my answer is kind of that, one, I don't think it's a good system, but two, just because of the order of technology we got, I think it ended up being somewhat inevitable.
What do I think about Jeffrey Epstein's banker being concerned that a distributed, decentralized, open public money could potentially be used for bad things? Sitting on a ski resort in Davos? I don't really care. I don't know why anyone cares, right? I mean, that guy knows when money's used for bad things. So it's a weird opinion of his. And my pet rock was up, as you said, 160% last year. It performed well against the dollar. So I don't know. I don't really care what that guy has to say about Bitcoin. I don't know why anybody does.